uploaded to our YouTube channel and Facebook page, where you can already find the recordings of our previous lectures. It is my honor to present Professor Mark Vessey from the University of British Columbia. Professor Vessey specializes in the study of Latin Christian literature and culture, particularly in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, but also in the Renaissance and the early modern periods. His groundbreaking research has significantly advanced our understanding of how texts were read, transmitted, and interpreted in Christian communities during late antiquity. He is particularly well known for his work on Jerome and Augustine, focusing on their engagement with classical literary traditions and their role in shaping Western intellectual history. Professor Vessey is a professor at the University of British Columbia and has served on the editorial boards of key academic journals in the field. He has also served for many years as the principal of Green College at the University of British Columbia and as a member of the Council of the International Association of Patristic Studies. He has been a visiting fellow of All Souls College at Oxford University and a visiting professor of Augustinian Studies at Villanova University, Philadelphia. Among his many publications are Latin Christian Writers in Late Antiquity and Their Text from 2005, an English edition of Augustine's Confessions from 2007, as well as numerous essays on the interplay between classical and Christian traditions in late antiquity, as well as pioneering works on literary and hermeneutical theory in Erasmus' writings. Today, Professor Vessey will discuss Prefacing Jerome, author, genre, and readership in Latin Christian milieu of the early to mid-390s. We will take questions after the lecture, so if you want to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand or put your name or question in the chat. Now, without further ado, Professor Vessey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oz, for that lovely introduction. Thanks to you and your colleagues for this very welcome invitation. It's very good to be this close to being back in Jerusalem again. I need to slightly rebalance, I think, the elements of my title. Prefacing Jerome, I think, is still a fair description, and I will come back to issues of author, genre, and readership in Latin Christian milieu of the early to mid-390s. But I thought I'd take the opportunity of this talk to step back. Nowadays, when people in politics and the media say they're stepping back, it normally means they expect to be charged with criminal offenses. That's not the sense in which I'm using it. I'm just stepping back for the sake of perspective. See whether the view from where I take you makes any sense to you. I'll be very interested to know whether it does or not. There are going to be now this is not advancing as I was expecting. Oh, there we go. How did I do that? I shall just have to learn how to do it again. Oh, I think I've got it. Great. There are going to be three parallel sections, I would say. There are connections. I hope they will join up, but they are also, in a sense, in slightly different planes, superimposed on each other. The first one, What's Past Are Prefaces, that's with apologies to William Shakespeare, one of whose characters, I think it's Prospero in The Tempest, famously says, "What's past is prologue," a phrase that's often quoted to make the point, well, that was history, now let's get on with the live action. Here we go. Before we were swept away by a tsunami of introductions, guides, companions, and handbooks on every conceivable topic in the humanities, there was a minor vogue for books entitled A Preface to So-and-so or to such and such. So-and-so was an outstanding author figure in a cultural history extending from antiquity to the time of the prefacer, who was male and white like the prefacee. Such and such was the masterpiece for which its author was best known. Three of those preface books leap to my mind because they were lying around in paperback when I was an undergraduate. Their so-and-sos in descending order of antiquity were Plato, Chaucer, and Milton. The first to appear in 1941 was a preface to Paradise Lost, a slim volume of lectures by a member of the Oxford English faculty, C.S. Lewis, the brilliant Christian apologist and author of the Chronicles of Narnia, whose scholarly reputation rests on such works as The Allegory of Love, a study in medieval tradition, and English literature of the 16th century. Catalogue entries for my university's library suggest that there may be as many as 8 copies of A Preface to Paradise Lost still on its shelves, while a note in one of those entries that copy 34 has been missing since 2011 hints at the currency Lewis's book once had. The next item in this mini-series was by another scholar of English literature, Princeton medievalist D.W. Robertson, Jr., whose preface to Chaucer, Studies in Medieval Perspectives, plural, Princeton University Press messed up the subtitle in this legacy edition, weighed in at over 500 large format pages, plus high quality black and white plates, originally in 1962. Then, as you can see, there was the preface to Plato by British-Canadian, Harvard-based classicist Eric Havelock, published in 1963. C.S. Lewis famously died on the day President Kennedy was assassinated. These self-styled prefatory books were written by men of my grandfather's generation when they were in their scholarly prime. That's how far away they are from us. It's part of their residual interest. They are remote enough in time to have become, as it were, available to historians, like archival materials newly released to the public. Testimony to their own moment, they can also be read as untimely prologues to ours. It's an obvious point, but worth underlining, that the work done by scholars like Lewis, Robertson, and Havelock during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s was as much a critical stock-taking of the symbolic and technological resources of contemporary European Atlantic, NATO-politan, or Western culture, in both narrower and broader senses of the word culture, as it was of those of classical Athens, the Latin Middle Ages, or 17th century England. A more pointed way of putting this would be to describe their books as products of a wartime or post-war or Cold War academic and imaginary complex, analogous to the military-industrial complex described by President Eisenhower in 1961. Our mid-20th century book-length prefaces were collaborators on a modernist myth. In an epilogue to the forthcoming Cambridge History of Later Latin Literature, I call that myth the Western Classic. A student of Havelock's named Walter Ong wrote about, I quote, the technologizing of the word. That's his book on orality and literacy, now up in the top left-hand corner of the slide. The technologizing of the word was in fact already the shared subject of the 3 preface books, current in my youth. Both Lewis and Havelock began with Homer. Lewis to unfold a transition from primary or oral to secondary or written epic in the ancient world, and a sequence of secondary epics culminating in England with Paradise Lost. Havelock to map a seismic shift from oral to literate forms of thought and expression on the basis of the writings of Plato. The visual media in Robertson's preface to Chaucer were there for confirmation of an exegetical and epistemological scheme derived from early Christian biblical interpreters, notably Augustine. Robertson set Chaucer, the reputed father of English poetry, in a closer relation of dependence upon the fathers of the church than could have been divined from his wife of Bath's quotations of Jerome. If you know Chaucer's Wife of Bath's Tale, you'll perhaps remember that her prologue is a tissue of reminiscences of Jerome's tract against Jovinian. It's one of the liveliest readings of Jerome I think we're ever likely to have, and I say that in the company of some of the liveliest readers of Jerome of our time. So, when did anyone last assign a preface to Paradise Lost to their students? Robertsonian exegetics was never more than a niche activity in medieval English studies. In present-day discussions of orality and literacy, Eric Havelock is more likely to appear as a straw man than as an authority. Yet at the date of their original publication, each of these preface books was a radical intervention in the central area of what we now think of as Western book culture. The language I used in my thumbnail summaries of those books, transition, sequence, shift, dependence, tradition, is ineluctable. Each of these books picked up, revised, and retransmitted a scheme of succession or supersession that made sense as part of a meta-narrative joining antiquity to modernity across a medium aevum. The intermediateness of that middle age ensured the mediation of a cultural paradigm. Similarly, successionists and supersessionist structures could, of course, be found underpinning almost any book of any range and ambition in any one of several fields in the humanities written before 1970, and in many of those written since. If the books by Lewis, Robertson, and Havelock merit attention again, it's now less for what they did to revise and reinforce an ambient order of discourse than for their upfronting, if you will, of one of its basic devices, the preface. Book culture, technology of the word, order of discourse. I let those concepts slide into each other because they do anyway. The order of discourse was the theme and title phrase of Michel Foucault's inaugural lecture at the Collège de France in 1970. That lecture begins with the speaker wishing, as we've all wished at some time or another, that he did not need to begin and could instead slip unremarked into a conversation that was already going on. After that, it analyzes some of the devices that regulate the ongoing discourse or conversation of modern society in books, as well as face-to-face interaction. There was no need for Foucault to mention prefaces specifically among those devices. The impossibility of beginning an inaugural lecture at the Collège de France without making a preface spoke for itself. Everyone who reads the order of discourse, mistranslated as the discourse on language, remembers how it begins. Foucault's commentary on a painting by Velázquez at the beginning of Les mots et les choses, mistranslated as the order of things, had already proved him a consummate prefacer. The only competition came from Jacques Derrida, whose alternative preface to Plato book, Dissemination, published the year before Foucault's inaugural lecture, compounded one of the riddles of its author's earlier writing on Rousseau. Il n'y a pas de hors texte. Translatable over literally, and at the cost of everything we used to read Derrida for, as, here we go, there are no slipped-in pages or inserts in the book of this work, at the beginning of it, or anywhere else, because if they were, they would not be in the work, and the work would not be the work. Il n'y a pas de hors texte. The corollary of this principle of the total inclusiveness of the work as book was the deconstructibility of the work as text, its openness to being undone from the inside. The preface is a particularly upfront variety of the hors texte qu'il n'y a pas, a text that is supplementary to the work and constitutive of it, external and internal to it, apart from it and a part of it. Since the 1990s, Gérard Genette's concept of the paratext as what enables a text, I'm quoting him now, to become a book and to be offered as such to his readers and more generally to the public, has become the platform for a new subdiscipline or superdiscipline of book historical studies, characterized by a fine attention to bibliographical and social contexts, and most of the time also by a fine unconcern for post-structuralist thinking, such as Derrida's or Foucault's. We should keep in mind, however, that the original title of Genette's 1987 book was Seuils, sills, or thresholds, and that his focus was on the features known in the English book trade as preliminaries, meaning the contents of a book, including its table of contents, that precede its contents. You don't need to be a Derridian to make that statement sound deconstructive. Having no better argument, I'm going to have to appeal to your experience to support my conviction that besides the passage of time, which sooner or later opens all archives, it's the writing of thinkers like that, and not all of them French and not all of them white men, that have put us at sufficient distance now from the mid-century prefaces of Lewis, Havelock, and Robertson to see how their books worked back then and why our own books about author figures like Jerome should work differently. One reason, presumably, why the trope of the book as preface recommended itself to academics who, as late as the 1940s or 50s, were returning to author figures as long-standingly canonical as Plato, Chaucer, and Milton, was that that preface trope simultaneously deferred and guaranteed the reintegration of their subjects into an interpretive totality. By troping one of the physical properties of the codex style or spine-hinged book, namely its closure upon itself, the book as preface opened a modest space for cultural revision. As I've noted already, all three of these books were in fact highly innovative. Robertson's and Havelock's were substantial works of research that radically challenged a prior consensus. Lewis's book of lectures was also strikingly original. Whether by styling their works prefaces, these authors meant to disarm or to provoke critical reaction hardly matters now. What was important was that the title pre-confirmed a unity of discourse that was as safely beyond argument as it was beyond the page limits of any book. While we could draw these inferences without resorting to Genette's pragmatics of the book, Derrida's theory of the text, or Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, their writings should prompt us to look beyond our handful, my handful of Anglophone prefaces, and consider how closely entwined by the middle of the last century, the affordances, the special properties, that is, of a certain culture had come to be linked with those of a particular technology of the book. As straws in the wind, I'll mention just three more landmark works of mid-century literary criticism and history, and then a fourth. The first chapter of Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature, is really a preface, named for Homer's Odysseus, but led off by a dazzlingly close-up re-narration of the biblical story of the averted sacrifice of Isaac, ventriloquized from a homily by Origen of Alexandria, as translated by Rufinus of Aquileia, rival and imitator of Jerome. Auerbach's essentially Origenian exegesis of that piece of Near Eastern scripture makes it the Archimedean point from which to lift an entire Western literature. Ernst Robert Curtius's European Literature in the Latin Middle Ages contains a chapter on the book as symbol that was a vital stimulus for the opening sections of Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology, the book in which Derrida originally wrote Il n'y a pas de hors texte. Curtius's book would also later spur Derrida to doubt aloud whether there could be anything, quote, like literature, like an institution of literature and a right to literature in any non-Latin Roman Christian culture, or more generally, any non-European culture. As I've shown elsewhere, Curtius's ability to present such a European literature as a trans-historical unity, beginning with Homer and continuous to Goethe and beyond, depended critically upon his excluding from his own book, in one of a series of preliminary essays that appear there as excursuses at the end of it, any account of how, quote, preoccupation with the Bible and the rise of Christian writing could have influenced literary theory. For that, Curtius admitted in one of his excursuses, Jerome is of primary importance, or he would be, outside Curtius's own book, or he might be. In the fourth essay of his Anatomy of Criticism, coming to the third book here now, Northrop Frye anatomizes an entity that he calls book literature, since he says he cannot call it scripture, that Latinate word having become too specialized in meaning, standing as it did in our culture for the Christian Bible. The Bible to one side then, Frye's book literature is essentially prose fiction, a category that he expands on two axes, one of which aligns the modern novel with the ancient romance, while the other has for its poles the forms that Frye calls confession and anatomy. The model for confession is, guess what? Augustine's Confessions. And Frye even describes his own preface to Anatomy of Criticism as a confession. Good for Augustine. The name of Jerome does not even appear in the index to Frye's book, despite, or perhaps because, of his close association with the very Latin scripture that is at once the avowed and the unavowable double of Frye's secular book literature or prose fiction. Tellingly, after the Anatomy, Frye's most important critical book would be called The Great Code, the Bible and Literature. And by code, he meant codex, like his hero, the poet William Blake, who would call the Old and New Testaments the Great Code of Art. Now, that's a lot of mid-century literary criticism and history to load upon you in a small space, but you can perhaps already see my point in rehashing those three masterworks by Auerbach, Curtius, and Frye, the first two of them at least, I assume, still somewhat familiar to medievalists, whatever their specialization. Examine the book technological apparatus of some of the 20th century's most important theorists of Western literature, beginning with their prefaces, and you quickly run into Jerome as absent presence or uninvited guest. Couldn't someone around that same mid-century have devoted a separate book of literary criticism and literary history to Jerome? Someone did. He was Valéry Larbaud, author of Sous l'invocation de Saint Jérôme, In the Name of Saint Jerome, published in Paris in 1946, the same year as Auerbach's Mimesis, in time for celebrations of the 16th centenary of the saint's birth the following year. It was Jerome, Larbaud wrote, who gave the Hebrew Bible to the Western world and constructed the broad viaduct that linked Jerusalem to Rome and Rome to all the peoples of the Romance languages. What other translator carried out so colossal an enterprise with such success and with consequences so far-reaching in time and space? In all but title, Larbaud's book was a preface to Jerome and Western literature, very much of its mid-20th century moment. Just to the right of the slide there, I've slipped in one more book, which I won't discuss now, by Pascal Casanova, The World Republic of Letters. It's been extremely influential for people working in the field of world literature since the turn of the millennium. That quotation that I've just given from Valéry Larbaud's book on Jerome occurs deep in a footnote at an absolutely critical point in Casanova's argument. So that's a thread that one might pull on another day. But we need to press on and move to the next of the three planes of this perspective taking, as I'm calling it. Jerome, prefacing Jerome. The most consequential preface to Jerome from the early print era is the life of Jerome, compiled on the basis of the saint's own writings, Ex ipsius Potissimum Litteris, by Erasmus of Rotterdam. It appeared at the beginning of volume 1 of the 1516 Basel edition of Jerome's Letters and Epistolary Opuscula. The main sources for the Erasmus's life of Jerome, as you would expect, are Jerome's letters and prefaces. As Brian Cummings has pointed out, Erasmus's prefacing of his edition of the New Testament, initially entitled Novum Instrumentum, as shown in the second image on the slide there, first issued in 1516, and so contemporary with his Jerome edition. Erasmus's prefaces in that biblical edition of his reveal a sensitivity to the rhetorical character of Jerome's biblical prefaces, including his letter 53 to Paulinus of Nola, which had served as a preface to the Vulgate from the 9th century onwards. Looking ahead to an edition of his own Opera Omnia, Erasmus stipulated that his prefaces to editions of classical and patristic authors should be reprinted in the same volume as his more familiar letters. The term epistoliterarity, coined by British classicist John Henderson for the quality of Cicero's epistolary output, might, I think, be reapplied in a different sense to mark the extent to which Jerome's and Erasmus's fashioning of a literary oeuvre and persona relied on epistolary devices, including, crucially, the preface. I think in this respect, Erasmus is unlike any other prefacer before him, certainly in the classical realm. This is a huge subject for further research, which I'm only really going to put a toe into this evening or this morning, depending on where you are. After Erasmus, the next consequential preface to Jerome is the hodgepodge of erudition, guesswork, and Gallican ecclesiastical propaganda served up in the Prolegomena in Divinam Sancti Hieronymi Bibliotheca that introduce Jerome's biblical translations in the inaugural volume of the Maurist or Benedictine edition of his works. That is the Opera Omnia, curated by two Benedictine monks of the Paris-based congregation of Saint-Maur, namely Jean Martianet and Antoine Pouget, which appeared in 5 volumes in Paris between 1693 and 1706. Now, before we even get to these prolegomena of Martianet's, we find ourselves face to face with Jerome. Just take a moment to look at that engraved frontispiece from 1693, because it's a real beauty. Some of you, I expect, have seen it before. I'm going to linger over it, with apologies to anyone who's heard earlier workshoppings by me of a tour of this engraved title page. You can take a break or make a coffee now, because you've heard at least some of this before. Saint Jerome, as you see, leans into his page, right hand index finger snug to the quill with which he's just completed the last stroke of an inscription ending with trans tuli, I have translated. I think you know what he's translated. I'll let you read the Latin unaided. That signature text dominates the frontispiece. It's excerpted from the notice given by Jerome on himself in the catalogue of Christian writers that he normally cites as his De Illustribus Viris, on famous men. The inscribed passage refers to the textual ensemble known after the Council of Trent as the Vulgate Bible. We're going to circle back to it. going clockwise now from 1 to 4, starting from Jerome's forehead. The passage from Famous Men is laid out as if incised in stone or perhaps impressed by cold type on a writing surface that mirrors another above it. In that superior register, number 2 on the slide, the opening lines of the book of Genesis appear as they might have done in the hexapla, the biblical synopticon devised by Origen, in which the Hebrew text of the Old Testament was written out in parallel with the Greek transliteration and translations attributed to the legendary 70, and in the order in which they appear here, to the individuals known as Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. In the engraving, the phrase usually translated "in the beginning," Bereshit, is legible across all 6 columns. The sequel is bleached out, though, by a shaft of heavenly light that the artist behind the engraving has skillfully trained on Jerome's face, making it shine as Moses' did when he came down from Mount Sinai with the tables of the covenant freshly chiseled under divine dictation. There's a lot going on here, obviously. Next, as a hinge between the hexapla and the saint's writing surface, the designer has inserted a partly unrolled roll or volumen. That's number 3. You won't be able to see what's on it, but I'll put that up in clear text across the slide. In effect, the designer has created then the illusion of a single supersized book opening of a hybrid type between roll and codex, with that inserted volumen acting as the hinge between, as it were, the upper page with the passages from the hexapla and the lower page being Jerome's writing slope. The composite text inscribed across that composite writing surface thus begins with Bereshit in square Hebrew letters in the top left-hand corner of the frame, and ends with Jerome's signature transtuli in Roman capitalis quadrata, while along the foredge of the axial volumen, illegible to you, runs another strap line in a cursive bookhand, which actually reads Desiderii mei desideratas acp epistulas. I have received the long 4 letters of my desiderius. That's where that's from. It's the first clause of Jerome's dedicatory preface to his translation of the Pentateuch, or 5 books of Moses, justifying his version according to the Hebrew. A preface that is addressed to a certain Desiderius, whose namesake, unless it was the same Desiderius, received a letter from Jerome, now number 47, recommending the catalogue of famous men for its handy listing of the author's writings. There's one more prefatory legend to be read off this tableau vivant of Jerome as latter-day Moses, at number 4 on the slide. Unfurling between a closed book on the saint's writing table and an open one propped up against others on the floor is a scroll displaying the first few words of the dedication of Jerome's revised Latin translation of the Gospels addressed to Pope Damasus. Novum opus me facere cogis ex veteri. You compel me to make a new work out of an old one. This sidebar could easily be taken or mistaken for a kind of internal caption to the frontispiece as a whole. Note, however, that the revision of the Gospels, for which Jerome claimed a papal commission, receives no separate mention in the listing of his works at the end of the catalogue of famous men, nor does the separate entry for Damasus in the famous men make any reference to services rendered by Jerome to that pontiff. Only subliminally, therefore, could the papal mandate, novum opus, etc., be seen as extending to the entire capital B bibliotheca, to which the saint's studio portrait serves as portal in this Moorist edition. There's something going on here, and I'm going to try to unpack it a little more fully. The contents of that bibliotheca were the Latin scriptures from Genesis to Revelation. but they were at the same time works of Jerome, claimed as such by him in his dedicatory prefaces and in the autobibliography at the end of Famous Men, and now filling more than 700 pages in this Thomas Primus, the first volume of his Opera Omnia. Now, Jerome's happens to be the first Latin version of the Bible or of any extended part of the scriptures for which we have an author's name. He's often called the author of the Vulgate. Yet, believe it or not, this 1693 edition was the first to print the biblical translations as part of Jerome's personal Opera Omnia. Hence the title page claim, Divina Bibliotheca ante hac inedita, hitherto unpublished. Just pause for a moment to take that on board. A century after the publication of the official Roman post-Tridentine Vulgate in the Sixto Clementine edition of 1592, the Maurist Jean Martianet and his sidekick Antoine Pouget had the chutzpah to publish as Jerome's work a collection of texts that, owing to its inclusion of more than one version of some Old Testament books, could hardly be called a Bible, lowercase b in the material sense, and because of its circumstances of publication, could not be called the Bible, uppercase B, in any official or theological sense, but that purported to contain all that was extant of Jerome's rendering of the canonical scriptures into Latin. Occupying the first volume of the Hieronymi Opera in the prestigious series of Maurist editions of Greek and Latin church fathers, the newly baptized Hieronymi Divina Bibliotheca simultaneously put Jerome's Bible, as Christopher Marlowe's devil-daring Dr. Faustus had called it, into a discursive space beyond the institutional control of the Roman Church and back within the totality of Jerome's authorial oeuvre as advertised in the postface of his Famous Men. Not that there was anything overtly Faustian about Martianet's undertaking. As you can see, the Maurist edition of Jerome was dedicated to Pope Innocent XII and bore the papal coat of arms on its title page. In his dedication, Martianet would be quick to style the present pontiff Damasus Redivivus, Damasus brought back to life, without, however, and this is important, making any more explicit reference to Jerome's claimed commission for a Bible translation. For this Hieronymi Divina Bibliotheca had no such authority. It was not the Bible as the Bible now was, meaning the Sixto Clementine Vulgate, even though, as Martianet is at pains to argue in his first Prolegomenon, Divina Bibliotheca could historically mean the Bible. Martianet's assault on the critical problem of the chronology of Jerome's biblical translations, and any of you who've worked on that will know what a nightmare it is, though it's focused in the prolegomena to this first volume, carries over into his discussion of the chronology of the author's other works, especially in the fourth volume, the second part of which contains the epistolary oeuvre, the letters, excluding the so-called epistolae criticae, which are printed with the New Testament commentaries in the first part. Jerome's other letters are advertised on the title page of that fourth volume as, quote, I'll translate the passage marked off there in the light blue pen. Letters now published for the first time in chronological order and distributed in various classes. This is Martianet beginning the process that Andy Kane and others have been carrying on in more recent times, and a process that I don't think we've probably quite finished yet, making sense of, sorting, arranging Jerome's letters. In this case, though, the letters were not yet disaggregated from the occasional and controversial works with which they'd traditionally been grouped in the manuscript tradition. As a result, Martianet's edition is extremely awkward to use. It's very difficult to know where you're going to find a particular polemical or occasional work, because it will be embedded somewhere in the order of the letters. Martianet's dating and reordering of the letters nonetheless marks a major scholarly advance, for which he's not usually credited. Along with the decision to include the biblical translations in the Opera Omnia, Martianet's critical work on the chronology of Jerome's letters was fundamental for the edition published half a century later by Domenico Valassi, which Migne reprinted, and which is still unsuperseded as the collected edition of Jerome's works. In retrospect, the drama of the 1693 Paris frontispiece lies in the capacity of its seated prefacer to be at once a timeless figure of stability and a portent of epochal change. The inherited tradition of the Church required Jerome to be the inspired and sainted author of the Vulgate, a super Moses of both testaments, brow radiant with divinity, chisel-like quill forever paused at the end of the final sacrosanct penstroke of the Book of Revelation. But the critical tradition of Western print modernity, as it was then shaping itself through the work of men like Martianet's occasional sparring partner, Richard Simon, mandated a new Jerome, a Jerome no longer received as divinely given, but instead projected as the long-term outcome of an arduous process of criticism or travail du texte that would progressively reveal the author, his life and works. There I'm channeling a bit of Michel de Certeau in a famous essay of his, partly about Richard Simon, whose scandalous and in any case historically very important Histoire critique du Vieux Testament I've included there on the strength of its title page. Simon and Martianet, the editor of Jerome, were in conversation. It just wasn't a very polite conversation. Textual criticism back then was so exciting. Of course, it still is. Before Valassi's, more so than Erasmus's, the Maurist or Benedictine Jerome is, critically and historically speaking, the immediate ancestor of our Jeromes. And therein, I suggest, lies the delayed challenge of that Parisian frontispiece for us. For us, both as latter-day continuators, one way or another, of a Maurist tradition of textual and historical criticism, and even less avoidably, as exponents of a condition that Jean-François Lyotard notoriously called postmodern. Is it possible, and this is really the question I wanted to put out there this morning, afternoon, or evening, is it possible to read texts catalogued under the name of Jerome, critically and historically, and not now fold their meanings and contents back into a pre-authorized culture of the West, the book or book literature? And how in practice might we do that, if it is possible? There are resources for a mid-21st century preface to Jerome. As many of you know, or perhaps even remember, a recognizably postmodernist or even post-structuralist streak began to appear in late antique historical and literary studies in the late 1980s. That streak has widened without ever becoming an ism of its own. I will mention only Elizabeth Clark's now 20-year-old history theory text, which was a kind of primer for the field. Of course, there can be no orthodoxy or set method in such matters. But there are, I think, recognizable lines of work running aslant traditions, fixing on the more eventful of event-given texts and text-given events, looking to relativize rather than simply remediate the orders of discourse of societies and cultures presumed to be ancestral to our own, to relativize those orders of discourse, and ideally also surprise ourselves. Postface. Oops, gone a bit far, but that's where we need to go. I want to zoom out now from the signature text on the saint's writing slope in that 1693 Paris volume and look at the whole of Jerome's notice on himself at the end of Famous Men. There it is. Even without highlighting, the epigraphic passage of the frontispiece stands out syntactically. Novum testamentum praece fidei redidi, vetus iuxta Hebraicum transtuli. The two first-person preterites, redidi, I have rendered, and transtuli, I have translated, mark these statements off from the preceding list of the writer's works, all of which are objects of the introductory preterite haec scripsi, I have written the following. That syntax is broken at the point at which Jerome mentions the biblical translations. Notice too that this biblical text bite, in light blue here, isn't strictly coordinated with either of the two ensuing items in purple, which relate to ongoing activities. Jerome's live correspondence with Paula and Eustochium, and a set of commentaries on the prophetic books of the Old Testament that at the time of writing covered just 5 of the minor prophets. By contrast, the revision of the Latin New Testament against the Greek and the translation of the Old from the Hebrew are represented as already finished works by the present year, which is the 14th of the Emperor Theodosius in the kind of cream-colored highlighting. A claim to have finished those translations of the Bible by the 14th year of the Emperor Theodosius that sooner or later ruins any attempt to devise a rigorous chronology for Jerome's public career as a biblicist. But that as advertising copy for the memorial frontispiece of the Benedictine edition of his writings could hardly be improved upon. Martianet himself does discover just how difficult it is to reconcile the chronology, as it were, of this notice of Jerome's on Jerome in the Famous Men with reality. It's quite fascinating reading his prolegomena and seeing himself slowly back himself into the corner, which Jerome had marked out for him and for all historians and critics of his work in advance. The retro-prospective effrontery, to call it that, of Jerome's original self-presentation is, well, sublime. He exaggerates the coverage of his revision of the New Testament, advances by more than a decade the completion of his Old Testament Iuxta Hebraicum, if in fact he ever did complete it, and sets no limit to his traversal of the Opus Prophetale. My dictionary defines effrontery as insolence or boldness, from late Latin effrons, putting forth one's forehead, which is exactly what Jerome does at the end of his Famous Men, if not as radiantly or mosaically as Claude Guy Allais, designer of the 1693 frontispiece, would one day show him doing. Sublime as Jerome's self-frontispicing is, one might suggest other epithets for it too. Augustine already suggested one in a letter notifying Jerome that a codex of his Famous Men had come into his hands lacking the cover leaf with the author's name on it. Augustine's hapax phrase for the missing page is liminaris pagina, a nice anticipation of Gérard Genette's Seuil or Sill. It's clear that Augustine's copy did contain Jerome's preface, addressed to Mummius Aemilianus Dexter, Praetorian prefect in 395. Thus, the page with the preface, the subliminaris pagina, as it were, was uppermost in Augustine's copy. The word subliminary is not in the dictionary. It does, though, catch something of the subtlety, sublimity, and subliminality, not to say subterfuge, of a typical Jerome preface. And it also allows us to use the epithet supraliminary for a Jerome paratext that, whether occurring at the front of a book, like his dedication to Dexter in Famous Men, or at the end of it, like his autobibliography here, looks beyond the limits of the work in question to those of a larger bibliographical and discursive unity. Where, we might ask, was Jerome looking in that Paris frontispiece? By occupying Moses's heavenly limelight and pointing to the supposedly finished works of his own hand and mind, the barefoot virtuoso of a newly printed Divina Bibliotheca draws the reader's eye to a space that frames a text that is his and yet also divine. The I verbs on his writing slope, I have rendered, I have translated, bring into lapidary focus an immense, still unfolding, providential history of written norms and narratives that, according to biblical record, began on the slopes of Mount Sinai. By what chance or series of accidents did Jerome's improvisatory self-prefacing help create a technology of the word so far beyond his or anyone else's personal agency? A present-day preface to Jerome, even if it cannot satisfactorily answer that question, should at least begin to answer it. To end now, let me briefly say where I'm going to begin again at a conference in a few weeks' time in Leuven on the beginnings and development of monastic hagiography. As we saw, inserted in the postface of Famous Men, between the listing of biblical translations and a postscript-like reference to work in progress on the prophets, is mention of an unspecified number of letters to Jerome's companions, the Roman widow Paula and her daughter Eustochium. Another day, there'll be something to say about that floating reference to an epistolary activity apparently unconfined by any book project. But I want to backtrack now to the two items in the bibliography immediately preceding the biblical translations, namely, highlighted in scarlet, the De Captivo Monaco, or Life of Malchus, and the Vita Beati Hilarionis, the life of Hilarion. I have written on a prisoner monk and a life of the blessed Hilarion, Jerome states. After which, for reasons I've already explained, we need to insert a punctuation mark heavy enough to withstand the cumulative pressure by then of a list that has run to more than 24 items of bibliography. Down to the present year, which is the 14th of the Emperor Theodosius, Jerome had begun, I have written the following: a life of the monk Paul, in scarlet. Then he reeled off 27 other items grammatically dependent on the verb scripsi. Now, we're evidently meant to read the sequence of Jerome's works in this postface as basically chronological. And we know Jerome only composed 3 formal hagiographies. So one way faithfully to short circuit his bibliography would be like this, quote, I've written a life of Paul, a bunch of other things, a life of Malchus, and a life of Hilarion. I've also restored the New Testament to the truth of the Greek and the Old according to the Hebrew. The letters I write to Paula and Eustochium are daily events. Additionally, I'm writing commentaries on the prophets. We could even go a step further and let Jerome briefly prophesy instead of prefacing. I, Jerome of Stridon, will be known to you in the 21st century for the Vulgate, for my commentary on the prophets, and for hanging out with aristocratic women. But don't forget my hagiographical romances. Ah, you haven't? Good, because that's how I started out, as a romance writer. I was still at it in Bethlehem in the early 390s. Then I decided to put all my eggs in a biblical basket. But you probably already know that, don't you, from reading my prefaces. In a section on Jerome as biographer in volume 6 of the Handbuch der lateinischen Literatur der Antiqua 2020, Yves-Marie Duval warned against mistaking the lives of Paul, Malchus, and Hilarion for, I quote him, a marginal experiment in the literary career of one whom we define as translator of the Bible, even if his hagiographical activity lapsed when he assumed the tasks of translator and exegete. Duval's metaphor of margins sends us back to the prefaces of Jerome's accident-packed hagiographies to see what they will show and tell us about the accidents of his oeuvre as a whole. Not because those prefaces, which have no named addressees, have been waiting all this time to speak to us, but because of how we will read them now. Jacques Derrida, writing in the margins of Augustine's Confessions, once said he wanted to make something happen to Augustine. To preface Jerome today, I'm suggesting, is to want to make something happen with Jerome. Not with Jerome, son of Eusebius from the town of Stridon on the border of Dalmatia with Pannonia, but with a Jerome work that has for a long time been instrumental to a certain literature of the book, but that could still surprise us, I think, even this late in the game. Thank you. And here are a few other things that I have in progress or just done on the subject of the subtitle for this lecture. So this is back now to author, genre, and readership in Latin Christian milieu in the mid-390s. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Vessey, for this inspiring talk. And we are now open to take some questions if there are. So please raise your virtual hand or just write something in the chat. Write something in the chat. So I will start, if it's okay. I was thinking during your talk about the role of Origen's heritage or legacy in this in the building of this specific image of Jerome as the new Moses. If the Renaissance people are saying something about the dependence of Jerome on Origen in this specific issue, or just ignore him, or well, so
it's an excellent question, Oz, and there is an answer to this which I'm not in a position to give you, but which other people working on scholarship on patristic editions in this period, particularly in France, like Jean-Louis Contin, certainly could answer, because the Benedictine confrère of Jean Martianet, Montfaucon, was already at work on an edition of the Hexapla. So the question you're asking is, did these guys talk to each other in the refectory? Now, what's intriguing to me and got me beginning to ask the question that you're asking and that I can't yet probably answer, is that this title page engraving predates the edition of the Hexapla that Montfaucon produces in the very early 18th century, if I remember rightly. So what are the sources for that reconstruction? I mean, it's a purely schematic reconstruction, so you don't really need to do any critical work beyond reading a few of the statements that Jerome makes about the Hexapla. But there's no question that there is a new level of interest and actually new levels of expertise in the matter of Origen's biblical scholarship in Paris by this time, and these editors of Jerome are in a position to be aware of that. So yeah, there is a larger complex. It is that complex that I very briefly and rather cryptically alluded to, of this revolution in textual critical theory and practice, for which Paris in the 17th century is one of the real crucibles, if a revolution could happen in a crucible. That's figures like Richard Simon, the other Benedictine editors working on editions of the Church Fathers. There's been a good deal of work on this area by specialists in the period. I'm only aware of a small part of it. But the great authority on these matters, as many of you already know, is a French scholar in Paris at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, Jean-Louis Quentin, a collection of whose essays on patristic editions in this period has just appeared as the inaugural volume in the series now being published by Brill, called Receptio Patristica, edited by Tony Grafton and Paolo Sacchet. So I'm struggling to remember the title of Jean-Louis' book, but if you Google Receptio Patristica and Brill, you'll find that series. And if Jean-Louis doesn't actually answer your question in that book, then drop him a note at the École Pratique and tell him that I set you upon him. No, it's an absolutely fascinating zone of critical work. I wish I were smart enough or industrious enough to be able to say more about it. But thanks for the great question.
Yes, Andy, please.
Thank you so much, Mark. Wow, so much to ask about, so much to reflect on. One of the takeaways that I have is that there seems to be and I think you brought this out very nicely, this perpetual tension between Jerome's impulse for self-monumentality, and we see in the autobibliography this almost shamelessness about, of course, that self-advertisement, but also self-aggrandizement. And so I translated, well, essentially I translated the New Testament. I restored it to its Greek truth, which of course is a massive exaggeration. He actually didn't even translate the four Gospels. He revised the existing one. So I mean, there's exaggeration on so many layers, but yet by the same token, even within his own lifetime, as we know, the Vulgate faced considerable pushback, and it did for centuries. And it wasn't until I think around the 9th century, I think you mentioned this, that it starts being copied widely and regarded with the kind of authority that Jerome would have that he aspired to before. But I did want to ask you one question, and of course we'll chat more about this in Leuven in a few weeks. When he mentions the three lives, I noticed that, and I hadn't actually noticed this in a very long time until you brought this up. So he mentions the Vita Pauli, the Vita Hilarionis, but not the Vita Malchi. It's on the captive monk. The name Malchus is not even in the title. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that, because in a sense, it's almost undermining his project, it would seem, that because on the captive monk, that assumes that he's assuming that the reader will know who this captive monk is. So he's almost assuming that the life of Malchus is perhaps it's better known than it actually may have been. I'm not sure if you have thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, because of you, I'm happy to have thoughts about it. I'd never really given these lies by Jerome much serious thought at all before. But now that you've stirred up this whole intrigue around the beginnings and development of monastic hagiography, I have to worry about it too. And the more I worry about it, the more worrying and interesting it gets. So we're back now to questions of author, genre, and readership. What is going on with this styling of those lives as a group? And with the way that Jerome variously styles them in his other references to them, and the way then that he sets them up, both explicitly in such prefatory hints as he gives, and then implicitly because of the choices that he makes generically and, as it were, sub-generically in each case. We're going to have to go at this harder between us, you and I hope a bunch of other people, because one suspects that once again Jerome is trying a number of angles for reasons of his own, and he's interested, of course, in eliciting reactions as a partial response to your previous remarks about the earliest reception of the Vulgate. I mean, much of what we think we know about the pushback to the Vulgate is we know from Jerome. Much of what we know about reactions to Jerome, we know from Jerome. So when I say that Jerome is always interested in eliciting reactions, he's also interested, as it were, in pre-configuring reactions, because he's got this knack of beyond what I think authors generally manifest in this period and previous periods in related traditions, for, as it were, anticipating on the reception of his own efforts. This may have something to do with the coterie conditions in which, for much of the time, at least up to a certain point, Jerome is chiefly operating. I think one of the things that your work and that of others has helped us to begin to see is that we've got to allow for a Jerome who is sequentially and then also simultaneously operating in different milieux, with different audiences or readerships in view on several planes at once. And his particular sensitivity to, as it were, the conditions of his own reception, if it's not merely sort of neurotic tic, which is how it's sometimes been regarded in the past, is, I think, something much more situationally determined and strategically interesting. So yeah, what's the point of triggering whatever response Jerome thinks he's going to trigger by describing that particular hagiographical text at that moment as, on thee or a prisoner monk? This is why, as you know, I've been hammering away a bit at the question of just exactly when this text, the final notice of the De Viris Illustribus, goes public, because unless we're pretty confident of that moment, we could fall for another of Jerome's devices. Well, we're going to fall for them anyway, but we just don't want to fall too hard straight away. Good question, Andy. If you've not been thinking about it lately, then it's clearly time we got back to it. Thanks.
Any other questions? Yes, Shachar, please.
Thank you very much. This was a bit overwhelming for me, given that I'm an Occidentalist, as someone said. But I do wonder, I have a half-formulated thought about prefaces and genre, and how we should take the self-preface, right, or the introduction and presentation of someone for themselves, versus within a certain genre, within a certain framework, or even like a mode of writing of their time, let's say, as Jerome, as Augustine, as Gregory of Tours, versus prefacing, like a preface to someone, right? A preface to Jerome, as a scholarly preface to Jerome. Or a scholarly preface to a literary work, for instance, like a Paradise Lost. So it's a bit of a generic question. Like, how do you think a person like Jerome thinks about the the act of prefacing his work versus how we would consider it?
Well, this is, as you can tell, that's the question that I'm interested in raising and having people explore from whatever angles, Occidental, Oriental, global, they choose. I think that the racing certainty, if I could put it that way, is that there are very few innocent prefaces. The device of a preface is somewhat deliberate. I mean, this is what makes Foucault's non-preface to L'Ordre du Discours so delicious, is that he's very conscious that he is in fact prefacing his remarks even while trying to slip out of doing so. You can't really do an unself-conscious preface. All of our captationes benevolentiae at the beginning of our Zoom talks and other talks are you know, part of that same situational logic. We are acutely aware that we are making a start. There's a wonderful chapter in one of Edward Said's early books. The book is called Beginnings, and there's a chapter on the kinds of beginnings that writers make, especially in the late 19th century, at a time when the higher criticism in biblical studies is knocking away some of the foundations for the worldview that people in the Christian Europe had taken for granted for centuries. Said makes the point that, you know, there are certain times when beginning a text is particularly difficult. It's interesting to me that he coordinates the particular difficulty of that moment in Milieux with, as it were, the breakdown of a certain epistemic structure that's associated with ultimately with the Latin Bible, or certainly with the Christian Bible. So beginning again under those conditions turns out to be particularly perilous. Beginning, of course, for Jerome has been an interesting challenge, if we can say this, from the start. I mean, what are the generic expectations for a beginning writer like Jerome? It's a ridiculous question because there aren't any other writers like Jerome. Jerome is a weirdo. You know, so is Augustine. So are quite a few of these other fathers of the church, as they didn't know they were going to be. I mean, we're dealing with a bunch of eccentrics who sooner or later got institutionalized, because if they didn't, they'd be heretics. Or they simply, you know, wouldn't be part of the tradition anymore. The fact that, as it seems to me, Jerome is prefacing more self-consciously, more actively, and from our point of view, more teasingly and tantalizingly than most of his contemporaries and predecessors, is surely telling us something about his predicament. This is the moment to mention that Lucy Grigg at the University of Edinburgh and I are projecting a conference for some time not too far off on Jerome's prefaces in relation to other kinds of prefacing in his own milieu and, if relevant, others. So anybody who could be interested in that kind of thing, do drop a note to me or Lucy, and we'll make sure that we have you in the loop. Yves-Marie Duval, in that same wonderful, immense entry on Jerome in that recently published German handbook, says at one point, uncontroversially, I'm sure he thought, you know, Jerome's practice as a prefacer continues the practice of the classical tradition in such matters. I think that must be partly wrong. Jerome is an outlaw and an outlier, and his prefaces are more trouble than some other people's. I mean, not completely without company. There's some other very interesting prefaces around in that time. Some of you probably work on some of them. But this is an ocean that we're wading into. Jerome, I think, is particularly good provocation, but I don't think we'll be done with it when we're done with him. mean, the reason these tropes of the preface, the prologue, more generally what Derrida calls the hors text, the outside text that isn't outside the text unless it is, the reason that they're so intriguing and fruitful has partly to do, doesn't it, with the affordances of certain technologies. The possibility that we have of putting something in front of something else in a way that will determine how the second thing is then received. And you write a preface to set certain things up, but even as you're doing it, you can be unsettling the logic of the setup, which anybody reading a preface is expecting you to subscribe to. Foucault does that in a particularly flagrant fashion, but this is an inherently precarious discursive position to be in for the reader as well as for the author. I'll stop abstracting from what was actually a nice, sharp, particular question. If I could answer your question better, I would do so.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to think about in terms of preface as a literary device versus, let's say, preface as a device for grabbing your place in the world. This is what I meant. So if I'm thinking about Gregory of Tours and what Tamar Rothman was, her wonderful work from very recently, as Gregory of Tours presenting his own autohagiography, so to speak. So if I'm thinking about a preface in these terms, it's not a literary, or it's less a literary device than it is a device aiming at the world, or aiming at my taking my place as an author in the world, than it is introducing a framework of thinking for the reader. Or maybe.
Well, I mean, and you've called in question here precisely the category of the literary, which is the one that has been overarching this discussion because of the way I set it up. So one way to construe this is to say that talking about prefaces as we are doing is in fact a trick or a trope or a symptom of a particular literate mentality, which needs to be pushed back against. I mean, if we used prologue, it would, we're too used to saying preface and thinking of it as a literary device. But of course, prefari is just to speak out front, just as prologain is to speak out. These are all tropes of orality now recoded for literacy, but that can be turned on their heads. I mean, as Andy's got a lovely article somewhere on the way Jerome riffs off Terence's prefaces or prologues. When Shakespeare's Prospero says what's past is prologue, I mean, he's a character in a play which could have had a prologue of the, classical or Terentian kind. So there's one way of mediating the polarity that you've pointed out between the literary and, as it were, the real, is in terms of theatricality. The reason Northrop Frye has to worry about book literature is because he's dealing with a phenomenon which can't be traced back genealogically to oral and performative genres like comedy, tragedy, epic, or lyric. It's the point in Frye's book where he has to deal with literary genres that from the start have been literate. They're not taken over, as it were, from presumably previously oral and performative modes. So there's a bind here, but there are various ways out of it. And authors like Gregory of Tours and Jerome, I think, are already quite invested in not being caught in that oral literate binary that not only deconstructionists, but historians of every stripe have been trying not to get hung up on for some time now. I mean, one of the reasons I referred to Havelock's work was because that reminds us that there was a point, not long after the middle of the 20th century, where it looked as though figuring out the difference between the oral and the literate would be the key to all the mysteries. That's just a marker, really, of a certain epistemic shift within which I think we're still operating. I see Rosamund McKitterick's name on the screen, so I'm going to stop before I make a further fool of myself.
Yes, please. Yes. Yours, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for fine paper. I would like to come back to the bibliography of Jerome. I've always been intrigued by, well, bibliographies are a very strange thing. You have all kinds of things. You have people who put every single line they ever written in a bibliography. You have others who swear by selective bibliographies. You don't have to list everything that you've ever written. I just studied the autobiography of a 17th century polymath. And the strange thing is, half of what is in his bibliography has never been published, it's never been written even. So it is a bibliography of past and future, things that I have done and things that I will do and never did in the end, apparently. But that's the side thing. But I've always been puzzled by the position of the translation work of Jerome in this long list of works that he has authored, and linked to that, the way in which he presents it. He uses the word transtuli. He does not say, and I meddled a bit with the biblical text or so. He calls it translating. Yep. And it comes after a long list of all kinds of everything, commentaries and anything like that. How do you explain this strange thing? I would think when you are the translator of the Bible and you are very confident, as Jerome is, you put this as the very first thing maybe, or as the last thing in your list, something that really, where it really will strike readers that it's there. Now it is put away, hidden amongst all kinds of other things. Could that mean that he himself, even though he uses the word transtuli, is well aware that he is not really translating from scratch what he's doing, as a possible explanation? So it is an important work, but it's not all important, and it's not the work with which I want to be recognized in the future. So
there's the risk then that we're being over-influenced by 17th century French engraved title pages, mistakenly thinking that Jerome thought that particular part of his work was important. Yeah, and I think we've got to be wary of those risks of letting our own readings of what's happening in the 390s be overdetermined by.
But I think actually that the illustration that you showed us, I've seen this also many times, that this illustration is like a explanation by the editors of Jerome's opera why they put this translation in the opera omnia. After all, not consider it as that's the Bible. Yeah. It's not.
Well, it is. But I think it's. I mean, it is nonetheless responsive at a certain really rather literal and graphic level to an objective feature of that listing. As I pointed out, those two clauses relating to the Bible work are separate from the rest. I mean, we could suppose Jerome, like, you know, a well-organized modern scholar, has been keeping a bibliography of his own stuff, and he's been updating it, you know, in real time. And, you know, he's added the Bible translations once he finished them, ho-hum, and then he adds the things that, you know, work in progress.
Yeah.
That's possible. Again, that all the other contextual issues around that catalogue work of his serve to somewhat destabilize our assumptions about how it's working until we can be sure we know. Jerome's self-citation is something else, like his prefacing, that I think puts him if not in a class of his own, then at a, one end of a spectrum. By the mid 390s, so far as we can trust our chronology, Jerome is self-citing really quite a striking level. I mean, I can't think of another Latin church father who is as good as Jerome is at keeping us informed about what else he's written that could be relevant to this, or maybe not even terribly relevant, but he'd like you to know anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm a bit reluctant to take this notice of the De Viris Illustribus as too accidental. I have a feeling it's fairly well calculated. And if those pseudo translations are made to stand out as they do there towards the end, that's deliberate to a degree. I think perhaps one of the corollaries of the point you were making is that it's about the degree of certainty that Jerome would have at any point as to what he's doing and what it amounts to. And because, Valéry Larbaud is able to say, this is what Jerome stands for, doesn't mean that Jerome in 392, 3, 4, or 5 knew that that's what Jerome stood for. Jerome, like the rest of us, I suspect, spends most of his life trying to work out what, if anything, he or she or they might stand for. And this doesn't get any easier just because you write books, or doesn't necessarily get any easier. We don't have lots of evidence for people keeping lists of their own books in antiquity. Maybe we've just lost most of it, or maybe it really wasn't, in fact, something that people habitually did. Jerome is interesting in that respect, and people pick up on it, Augustine very notably. I'm circling around your question or questions just because they're really difficult. My own hunch in this matter, and this is a line that I've been arguing in a few places, is that Jerome does at a certain point in the early to mid 390s decide this Bible thing, whatever you call it, is going to be, as it were, the monumental center of his career, if we call it that. The difficult thing is to figure out how he gets to that point. And we are, of course, very committed, for good reasons, to creating some kind of a narrative continuity that gets him to that point as smoothly as possible. And, the more traditional biographies of Jerome look somewhat providential. Our biographies of Jerome have become less providential, but we're still somewhat invested, for good reasons of our own, in allowing him a certain degree of coherence and self-determination. One question that I've raised in the chapter on the De Viris Illustribus that Andy and Stefan Rebenich have in hand now for the Oxford Handbook of Jerome is a suggestion that Jerome and Augustine are in fact more closely, if not corresponding, then intuiting each other's purposes in the early to mid 390s than we've necessarily realized before. That Jerome, by the time he drafts this notice, is already reacting to Augustine and Augustine's coterie. And that's part of the reason for his coming out, as it were, in the colors he comes out in at this point. But that's an argument that I have to make and that may not work. But it's one way of trying to historicize the oddity of that self-presentation and the way in which it centers, if it does center, the Bible work at that moment.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Professor Vessey. Oh, yeah, Andy, please.
Very, very quickly. No, the conversation that you and Mark are having, I think you're absolutely right. That you know, if you read the De Vir's Philosopherus, the autobibliography, in a strictly chronological sense, it doesn't make sense, because the biblical work, especially the New Testament work, the Gospels revision was done in the early to mid 380s. Yet it's being put in the autobibliography after the life of Hilarion, the life of Malchus, which were written in the 390s. So clearly he's playing with the chronological order, and I think it makes complete sense what you're suggesting, Mark, that he's manipulating this so-called timeline, if that's how he wants to be presented, but really making it more of a topical timeline, so to speak, where it's putting front and center the biblical work, and it's capping this list with because in ancient oratories we know that oftentimes you'll dangle something at the very end, some kind of rhetorically effective way of saying something, or to try to hook the audience. You know, you leave them on a high note, so to speak. So but he clearly, I think, is centering his biblical work with this, and by manipulating the chronology of it in his own life. So I think you're completely onto something there.
Thanks, Andy. I mean, what one last thing I would say is I think he is to a degree in control of this list, but he's not altogether in control of it. And we know how that feels. I mean, try making sense of your own bibliography. You do have a measure of control over it, but there are also, I mean, as we know, this is part of what textual and literary theory has taught us. There are always constraining factors that take texts beyond their author's control, and that's true even of something as apparently straightforward as a list of things you have written. At least in a case like this, where, let's face it, the kinds of things that Jerome has by then written, whatever order he wrote them in, encompass considerable heterogeneity. So to put them in a single horizon with any kind of narrative, thematic, or other ordering principle is going to be, beyond a certain point, impossible anyway. It's got to be time for another meal or a drink or a coffee where everybody else is. Thank you all very much for worrying about these things with me for an hour and a half. I